Welcome to The Green Rush, a podcast about the intersection of cannabis, the capital markets, and culture. On a weekly basis, hosts Ann Donahoe and Louis Goldberg of KCSA Strategic Communications speak with the CEOs, financial experts, cultural icons, legislators, and generally interesting people moving the cannabis industry forward. But this week, Ann is out of commission, so we're bringing in Aaron Smith, former CNN cannabis reporter and now a KCSA team member, to talk with Evan Eneman, CEO of MGO-ELLO Alliance, a leader in the cannabis, financial, tax, and advisory services space. ELLO has worked with hundreds of businesses to help them solve complex problems in regulatory compliance, capital markets advisory, tax services, operational improvements, as well as staffing needs. Evan previously worked with Casa Verde Capital, a venture capital firm focused exclusively on the cannabis industry, which counts Snoop Dogg among its partners. Cannabis finance is spectacularly complicated and challenging because even though 35 states have legalized cannabis in some form, it's prohibited by the federal government, which means that most banks won't go anywhere near it. That's why some dispensaries and other cannabis businesses deal exclusively in cash, which creates a whole set of problems on its own. Don't sit back, lean forward, and learn about the world of cannabis finance.
All right, Evan, welcome to The Green Rush. I can't believe it's taken us this long to get you on. So you are the CEO, founder of the MGO-ELLO Alliance, which you have described, and I agree, is the Deloitte of the cannabis industry. But what does that mean? What is your company?
Yeah, it's a great question. So the MGO-ELLO Alliance was the first national accounting and consulting firm to fully commit to serving the cannabis industry and doing so wholeheartedly. So what that means is that we have resources, technology, experience, throughout the cannabis industry and other related industries. And the goal there is to provide a seamless suite of integrated services. We've worked with cannabis businesses at every stage of the industry lifecycle, from helping pre-revenue and growth stage startups to raise capital and structure their entities, to providing other value-added services like management advisory services or assurance services to cannabis industry leaders, whether they are going public or planning for mergers and acquisitions. So that's the model, providing a holistic approach to helping our clients achieve their objectives directly through our team members and collectively with our partners. And that really separates us from the rest of the advisory and professional services firms in the cannabis industry.
Well, thank you, Evan. My journey at a KCSA was an odd one. I guess we all have a story of how we got into the cannabis industry. I started out as a police reporter. I used to cover the gun industry for CNN. I also used to cover the cannabis industry, which I really liked.
I used to pitch you
yes,
stories.
That's true. That's true. Louis used to pitch me, and then eventually he hired me. I realized at a certain point I just wanted to go into PR, and I just wanted to work in cannabis. It just felt like me. I feel very comfortable here. Exactly. Yeah. Exactly. And I was wondering, what is your cannabis story? How did a nice CPA turn into the king of corporate cannabis?
Yeah, that's an interesting story, and it's kind of navigated a few different industries in many years. Like many other people, my first experience with cannabis was in college. It was after a breakup and a roommate, my freshman year roommate, and his girlfriend at the time wanted to get me to unwind and relax and kind of take my mind off of certain things and kind of have a nice experience. So that was my first experience. And they kind of took me through it in a very caring way, brought some really good flour, got some really good chocolates to have. And these were not infused at the time, but they were just really good chocolates, just so I can fully understand and experience what the, process would be. And so that was my first experience, being from New York and living in New York for about 11 years after school. That kind of curtails the cultural connection to the plant. And for a very long time, it was very much...
Wait. You lived in New York City and you're telling me that you had problem getting weed?
No, I did not have problems. I said the stigma and the cultural association was very different from what I
Right.
then experienced moving to California.
Yeah, there's definitely not the same. You're right. There is not the same cannabis culture in New York. It is a consumption culture. Like, call up the guy on the delivery, he shows up, and then he walks away, and you don't have any relationship with the industry.
Yeah, I mean, that's part of it, but it's more how people view consumers and consumption and the purpose for it. And that was really what was interesting for me. So I was in New York City for 11 years, working in consulting and leaving that to go into hospitality and to go into entertainment and media. And I moved to California because I had a film project with my business partner who was a film composer that won at Sundance, was up for a few Oscars, won not in the film scoring category, but it gave us an opportunity to take a plunge and move out to California. And that's when I really understood the cultural side, but not just the culture of consumption, but of health and wellness, and really what the opportunities of the plant can provide from a societal standpoint. And it was interesting because one of my close friends that I was a roommate with in New York City for a long time, he'd always make this reference when I was either stressed or frustrated and kind of reacting in a way that wasn't ideal. He would say, Evan hasn't taken his medicine, and of course, being in New York, being the stigma and taboo that it was, that would upset me even more. And I moved to California and realized what he was saying is that this really is a plant that provides very beneficial properties for certain people of a certain lifestyle. And for me, it was stress and growing up in that New York very tense and proper environment. Although I never had that mindset, I'm not a type A personality, so that brought me out to California. Really started to understand what this plant was, and through various activities and relationships, got involved in some early stage venture opportunities and launched a firm in that space. At the same time, launched a creative agency, and at the same time, we were going through that process after Washington and Colorado legalized in 2012 and implemented in 2014. We're working with companies and they all had the same challenges. They didn't understand either how to run a business, how to account for their business, how to create financial controls, how to focus on compliance or strong governance. All these things that I've done throughout my career, either when I was at a top professional services firm at PricewaterhouseCoopers, or running supply chain and e-commerce at a hospitality firm, or working with talent and entertainment professionals and the entertainment side of my experience. And so I found a partnership and a partner with MGO and decided that it was really an opportune time to launch ELLO, which is our dedicated cannabis advisory practice with MGO, to create the MGO-ELLO Alliance. And it really was to help to build the infrastructure of the industry, create trust and transparency, and add value that we didn't see being added at the time.
So why did you have to do this? Why didn't PwC or Deloitte identify the cannabis industry as an opportunity? Is it that they were too risk adverse, or you were just too smart? I mean, how did you beat them to the punch?
They're just way too risk averse. I mean, you have to understand their positioning. They are large multinational firms. They're looking to navigate a very complex and cumbersome federally illegal plant and substance. So there was no way for them to enter the space the same as many other large operators and brands. And so that created an opportunity for more nimble entrepreneurial firms and people to take their experience, enter the space, and really help bring that trust and credibility to the market.
Well, Evan, you are eyeballs deep in one of the most serious issues and challenges in the cannabis industry, the fact that the government prohibits the product and also equates banking with some form of money laundering. And I was wondering, how do you work around that? That is such a serious challenge to the industry, and it's something that really needs to be fixed going forward.
It does, and it certainly is one that has stymied the growth of the industry, has created some other public safety issues, and there aren't a lot of great workarounds right now. There has been some clear guidance around what banks can and cannot do. And so we do see a lot of smaller community banks or regional banks that are willing to support the cannabis industry and operators, either ancillary or plant touching, it just becomes much more burdensome from a compliance standpoint.
Can you give us a specific example of that? Like if I was a normal, I don't know, retailer, like I had a Starbucks, or not Starbucks, it's not a franchise, but if I owned a franchise coffee chain, right? What could I do differently that I couldn't do if I was part of MedMen, for example?
Well, you really can't get access to traditional banking services, financing vehicles, inventory financing, factoring. That was the nature of the industry probably 2 years ago. You really just had a bank that would effectively custody your cash and maybe offer you check writing, but really not do much more than that. You certainly can't process credit cards, or you haven't been able to process credit cards in a way that most other businesses can. So it's restricted people from operating in a very normal fashion and having to figure out workarounds. And now that has continuously changed. More banks are entering the space. We have a meeting next week with a very reputable West Coast bank that is interested in getting into the space. Again, just recognizing their risk and compliance obligations, and they're willing to do so because they see the opportunity. They understand that these are really honest, hardworking business people and professionals that are supporting the industry now.
Evan, I wanted to ask you about 280E. A lot of people in the industry complain about it. We know it's a law that originated back in the 80s to force illegal drug dealers to pay taxes on ill-gotten goods. But now even legal, tax-paying cannabis entrepreneurs have to deal with this hangover from the 80s because they're not allowed to claim business expenses as exemptions. Could you explain 280E? What is it?
Yeah, say it, dude. Yeah, you are like preaching. Preach.
Well, I'll tell you this. I am not a tax professional. So in my, experience in working with our clients and working with my tax team here, 280E effectively says you can't deduct normal business and operating expenses, general administrative expenses, with the exception of your cost of goods sold. So that means if you're a cultivator and the materials that you use to grow the flower that you're going to then process, package, and sell, that you can deduct. And every stage of the supply chain up through retail limits what you can take as a cost of goods sold. So in a retail environment, your floor space where you have your sales staff, that is not a cost of goods sold, but potentially some of your back office space or your inventorying or warehousing would be. So it creates this really complex structure of what you can and cannot deduct, which makes the entity structure as well as the resource allocation not so much difficult, but just more complex to set up. And you have to have a very clear purpose as to why certain things would be deductible as a cost of goods sold on the front end, rather than trying to do so on the back end. And so it's really creating a defensible position for what should and should not be deductible, what can be separate business entities. And a lot of times that's just good practice from a general industry standpoint, not necessarily from cannabis alone. For example, you might segment out your IP into an IP holding company. Well, that gives you the opportunity to have other expenses that might run through that vehicle that would be traditional to run through that vehicle, and not commingle it with the licensed operation of your retail establishment. So there are ways of thinking through how to structure the entities, operate, that address some of the limitations of the 280E sort of control. But at the same time, there's been a lot of momentum to eliminate that or reduce the onerous burden of trying to operate at a cost structure of significantly higher than any other business.
Yeah, and every public company who's in the space complains about it on every single earnings call. If but for 280E, the impact on EBITDA would be X. We both work with either public cannabis companies or pre-public cannabis companies that are going public. You guys are probably the sharpest consultants and accountants and advisors on the market. You've seen lots of these companies go either RTO or list on the OTC. If you could come up with like the 3 or 4 biggest, hurdle or biggest easy mistakes to avoid for a company that's going public, what would they be? What are the just like the dumb things that can trip a company up?
It's a great question. And obviously, going public is an incredibly complex undertaking. There are a lot of things that can go wrong, and there are many that we won't be able to talk about here. One thing that I can say is the process cannot be rushed. When we help clients prepare for the process properly, it's making sure that their financials and operations and entity structures are in order, and that there is a specific outcome driving this go public decision and process. So there are a lot of small mistakes that can be made early on, like financial inefficiencies in the tax structure, weak internal controls, or even a focus on what an internal control is, lack of corporate governance. These can all disrupt the go public process and cost companies hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars later on when operating as a public company. So there are some fundamental principles that can help companies avoid those common pitfalls, and that really is to have a complete understanding of the process, the good part of going public and what that allow a company to do, as well as the maybe detrimental parts of being a public company, and what the cost might be and what the reporting and regulatory requirements are. And that's very different. So, if you're thinking about it, think about it early on, think about what your exit strategy is, and build a really strong leadership team at the C-suite and your board of directors. And ideally, they've gone through this process before. Regardless of the cannabis industry, they've operated or they've gone through a go public process in any industry that will provide them really valuable guidance and experience in this process.
So, Evan, the U.S. House of Financial Services Committee recently released its draft text for their proposed marijuana banking bill. What are your thoughts on that? And what steps does this call for? And how do you think the industry is going to react to this?
Federal legalization addressing the cannabis banking crisis or issue is certainly long overdue. As we mentioned earlier, there's just tremendous amount of struggles around businesses operating, legally and lawfully and really in the best interest of the public and providing for public safety and trust. So, the current banking laws don't just create a difficult environment for cannabis businesses, but they do create that public safety concern related to cash-based businesses. So the complexity comes in asking whether or not we're putting the cart before the horse, and that rescheduling cannabis at the federal level or descheduling it is the priority, or do we make sure that we can create a robust banking infrastructure that allows operators to address those public safety issues, the transparency matters that we want to address. And so that makes it a really difficult goal. But the absence of that and the progress in the banking laws is of great value. The most recent draft, which includes greater protections for businesses and financial institutions, it's progress in the right direction. There needs to be much more. And I think the industry is cautiously optimistic and hopeful, if you will, that there has been such good momentum, bipartisan support at the legislative level, and it feels like we're on the right path. And the question is, how soon and how do we implement that? So there's a long way to go, but certainly it's a refreshing, sense of leadership on the Hill and moving forward to support the industry.
Just to remind everybody, you're listening to The Green Rush, and we're talking with Evan Eneman, CEO of the MGO-ELLO Alliance, the nation's only cannabis-specific accounting and consulting firm. We've both been in the industry now for years, not decades, but years. And, there are lots of people, the historic market participants, who look at the way that the industry has changed, grown, commercialized, not in a positive way. There's this tension between the historic stoners and the suits. If you looked at it that way, where would you put yourself? And then more importantly, is this a false dichotomy? I mean, is there really this tension still between the historic market participants and the new market entrants?
It's a really interesting question. There's a couple ways to look at it. I mean, certainly it is a false dichotomy as to the difference between the two supposed parties. It's not as big as one might think. The way I think about it is more of a mindset. And there are certain people who live their life to consume cannabis, and that might be looked at as a stoner, the stoner stereotype. And then there's the people who live and have a certain lifestyle that they enhance with cannabis. And so that's a really fine line between the two. And there have been a lot of professionals throughout history, obviously, that have consumed for various reasons, whether it's for, adult use or recreational purposes or for some sort of health and wellness aspect. I don't really define myself as one or the other. I am who I am, and that's kind of how I always will, conduct myself and be. And everyone else can lay labels and claims and pass whatever judgment they want. That's not something that I really do concern myself with. But whether someone's wearing a T-shirt or a suit and tie, the reality is the industry is full of intelligent, creative, and driven individuals. Obviously, all of us on this call included. On the outside, if you're looking at it, it makes for some really interesting networking events. But ultimately, we as a population agree on the sensible regulation of cannabis. We all have a lot of great ideas about how cannabis businesses can work, and everyone's on the same side. And I think it's a matter of dropping the stigma and kind of putting your guard down and just taking people for who they are, whether they consume or not, should not be a factor in that.
So, Evan, you were basically saying that the fix to cannabis banking and cannabis finance is to basically lift federal prohibition, that would be more important than basically any marijuana banking bill or any kind of Cole memo or anything like that. Realistically, how long do you think it might take for that to happen? And since the stigma still seems to be sort of fading and it is becoming less controversial as time goes on, what do you think is really preventing Congress from getting rid of federal prohibition?
Well, that's a very complex question. And I'm not sure I'm saying that's the only solution rather than having some of the banking reform or other steps in the process. I think they all serve a purpose. Completely descheduling, lifting the overall, ban and allowing for the plant to be fully studied, fully implemented in society, I think is something that we should be working towards. How we get there, that's just part of our process. And if we look at a macro level and what we see around the world, whether that's in the legalization, happening in Canada, or the World Health Organization and the European Union recommending rescheduling and descheduling to, at the very least, provide for research and development and understanding of the plant and all its myriad components, that's really where we need to get to. From a time perspective, the U.S. sits in a really interesting period of time, a very politically divisive, point in time where we have this bipartisan support for some form of legalization, whether that's reschedule.
No, it's over 60% for adult use. It's like there's nothing polls as high as legalizing cannabis. It's not even close.
Yeah, and if only our lawmakers and policymakers listens to people directly and listen to the percentage of interested parties, we'd be great. Unfortunately, that's not the case. We have minorities in terms of policy perspective that run the country, and unfortunately that creates a really challenging environment for everyone else. But nonetheless, this election cycle is probably going to drive a lot of the direction of the industry. And we see almost every single candidate on the Democratic ticket talking about cannabis reform, criminal justice reform, trying to address the societal harm that's been created by the failed war on drugs. And ultimately, on the other side, you may see some of that. You may see people that have been impacted by the opioid epidemic and taking a different look. But there also is the economic benefit. And, certainly, descheduling of any, illicit substance and not cannabis alone, but really anything, it has its benefits and it has its, potential concerns that we should think about. And we need to study it.
Isn't Oregon looking at hallucinogens on the ballot.
Psilocybin, and MDMA studies around PTSD treatment. I mean, these are things that should have been going on for years. We've lost decades of research, and ultimately we've hurt ourselves. And the question also came back to why has this been the case? And many people will point to very strong and effective, well-pocketed lobbying groups from different industries. And although that may be entirely the case and the reasoning for it, I think it's just a situation where we've had some very slow-moving people that are unwilling to change their position because of decades of misinformation and disinformation campaigns that had a very specific intent and purpose, which was to keep the plant illegal, to keep all the byproducts of it illegal, because of the
to keep the I'm sorry, but it drives me nuts. Also, it was also designed to keep the for-profit prison system filled with people who are black and brown who were either selling or consuming the plant. I mean, it was
absolutely
it's absurd.
It's one of the challenges that we have. And, people want to call things a certain way, socialism or democratic socialism and, people taking handouts. But then we also are happy having government funding for roads and infrastructure and other things that we look at. And so, the for-profit prison system is a really significant societal challenge that we need to address, and we need to address it immediately. And there are a lot of people that are being very outspoken. Unfortunately, again, some of that falls on deaf ears. And
do you know Danny Moses?
Familiar with the name. I don't know.
Danny's a friend of ours, a friend of the podcast, but he's a private equity investor in the space. He was part of The Big Short. He was in the book, he was in the movie, and he actually does a podcast called Bail Street that really focuses on this, is on the prison industrial complex. And it's well worth a listen. And two, he's a big investor in the space. I'll have to introduce you guys.
Yeah, that would be great.
Now, Evan, earlier, I know you're a finance guy, not necessarily a banking guy, but you did mention earlier in the conversation that there are some regional banks that have stepped up and decided to offer banking services to some of these cannabis businesses. I've always actually really been impressed by that. Citibank won't do it, but you'll have a regional bank in Maryland that will step up and offer banking services to dispensaries. I wanted to ask you, considering the risk that they're taking, if it is a big risk, why are they doing it, and how do they get away with it? How do they make it happen without getting in trouble?
Well, everything you do is a risk, whether it's banking or not banking. I mean, the risk to a Citibank of not supporting the industry is that they're never going to have the accounts that are of the largest cannabis operators in the world. That's a risk to them. So it's on both sides. I mean, from the perspective of why they're doing it, certainly there is an opportunity to have a robust relationship with hyper growth companies and entrepreneurs and people that are doing this for the right reason. And ultimately, there's a financial incentive for them to do so. They can also right now have, higher margin services in the cannabis industry, given the additional risk and compliance that they have to go through. But ultimately, they're really adhering to FinCEN guidance and what was originally proposed in the Cole memo. And so they have this protection of, if we're operating in a state where it is legal and we're complying with FinCEN guidance and everything else, we feel comfortable with the enhanced compliance controls in place, and we're going to serve the industry. And that may be a moral or ethical reason. It may just be purely a business reason. Either way, it's good for the industry, and we're happy for that to happen. And ultimately, that won't be a risk factor and a hindrance to the industry growth.
Last year, we saw a tidal wave of RTOs and raising a ton of money. And we saw Canopy get, $4 billion investment from Constellation. And we saw the start of the M&A tidal wave that was predicted to crest. What is this year looking like for you guys from both a new listings perspective and facilitating M&A?
There's been a lot of activity, and there will continue to be. Last year was unique. A lot of people looking to the public markets to gain access to, retail communities and retail investors, to gain access to capital that they're not otherwise able to get in the private markets. And we've seen that go really well. We've seen it go terribly wrong, and so that's a really important distinction to make. It's not always good for everybody, and it's not always the right path for everyone. With that said, we do see a lot, or we did see a lot of pullback towards the end of the year. Right after Canada went fully legal in October, there is a slowdown in the process for the RTOs and IPOs in the different markets, especially in Canada. And that was just the dynamic of the market. We have seen that reverse quite considerably in the first few months of this year. A lot of our clients and prospects that are interested in going back through that process, getting set up for it. And ultimately, they're preparing themselves either for a public transaction or cleaning themselves up for an infusion of private capital as well. So that is picking back up. And again, it really is unique to the situation of the client. It's not right for everyone. But for those that understand how best to utilize it, it is a good opportunity. On the M&A front, we are still seeing considerable amounts of M&A, both strategic in the sense that large scale, in the U.S., multi-state operators are thinking about, now that they have cash and now that they have some infrastructure, they need brands, they need products to put through retail channels. And so
you look at what Acreage did with the Form Factory acquisition, right? I mean, they bought a formulator and co-packer that they're going to roll out nationwide. That's amazing. And the Ebu acquisition by Canopy, I mean, yeah, there is money sloshing around.
We're seeing it, and we're seeing it in the U.S. and we're seeing it internationally. Obviously, the Canadian LPs are able to move a little bit more nimbly in international markets. And in the U.S., it's a lot of sort of internal consolidation, if you will, which is exciting for the industry. It's that first wave of M&A that happened last year. We're going to see another wave this year, and we're going to consistently see that as new entrants come in, build strong brands or good operations that have strong fundamentals. The larger scale operators are going to look to acquire. And I think we'll probably see some distressed assets as well that will be ripe for acquisition or some other restructuring. And so we'll see the market continue to shift pretty dramatically over 2019 and into 2020.
The legalization experiment became a lot more serious when Canada came on board. And it's real interesting to look at it from the American perspective and to just see them raking in the money, to be pulling in all this American investment and investment from Europe, all these other countries. They're actually going to be able to export this stuff to Europe. And here we are, it's still illegal on a federal level. I was just wondering what you thought about that from a financial perspective, to be looking at Canada, to be looking at the opportunity they have for as long as that window of opportunity lasts. What are we missing out on? Is that going to be the big incentive that really pushes Congress to finally do something?
It's really interesting. I mean, if you look at the industry as a whole in its entirety, not just domestically, but internationally, it's still a relatively small industry and it's still early on in its life cycle. So are we missing out on a lot of the early opportunities today? Absolutely. I think it's great that Canada and obviously everyone there, Health Canada and government is really thinking through this in a way that is helping their country, both from an import and from an export standpoint. And it will force our hand at some point. We're seeing U.S. operators like Constellation make investments strategically into Canadian operators so that they can understand the market. But ultimately, everyone recognizes that the U.S. is the market to be in. It is the growth sector for the space. And it's not unlike other industries. I mean, not everything emanates or is derived from the U.S. And that happens in the beverage space and, spirits and beer, where you might get, barley or hops outside of the U.S. to brew certain types of beer. And so that's the difference of where the market is today, is that you have these artificial constraints. Once those barriers are dropped, I think the U.S. will remain but be a very significant player on the global scale. Are we missing out on some near-term opportunities? Absolutely. That's why everyone is going to Canada and other markets. We have some clients that are exploring other public markets that will be really interesting and first of their kind. And so, we're missing out in the near term. Long term, I don't think that's an issue, but it is something that will drive, I think, Congress to make a decision, even if just economically, as money pours out of the U.S., they're going to want to bring that back in.
Where are you seeing this smart investment money flowing? And you don't have to name names in terms of specific companies, but is it still the MSOs? Or are people now looking at ancillary service providers? Are they looking at individual brand companies? Like where do you see that investment capital flowing?
It's still flowing everywhere. And the way I look at it and the way I advise, either, partners or investors is to invest in what you know about, invest in where you see the opportunity, where you can add value, because there's value at every area of the supply chain and in every aspect of the industry. So if you are a traditional food and beverage investor, stick with it. That's where the industry is going. If you believe in infrastructure and manufacturing, then that's where you should focus your time and attention, because all of those are being developed right now. And as much as we have a few larger, call them more dominant brands, it doesn't mean that those are the largest and dominant brands that will emerge in the next few years. So, it's going to come down to execution no matter where you are, whether you're a brand looking to be the next, Coke or Pepsi, or you're a multi-state operator trying to navigate the complex regulatory framework of launching retail and manufacturing and distribution in all these markets. None of that's easy. And it comes down to execution. There's a lot of risk in that. So smart money is going to smart operators and people that understand strong fundamentals. And that doesn't mean they're not going to look for, growth and hyper growth and some risk takers, but they're going to want to see people that have experience in executing on their strategy. And that could be a small startup, and that could be a multi-state operator. It's really where you feel the most comfortable.
Evan, you are also not known not only for what you're doing with MGO-ELLO, but your time at Casa Verde, and you invested in some of the best deals there. What are you doing now on the investment side?
Yeah, so when I co-founded and launched, Casa Verde Capital several years ago, the intent was to build that trust and transparency and the infrastructure of the space, if you will, and that's still the mindset that I have. In launching a new investment firm called Sands Lane Capital, a lot of it really is the same approach. It's building strong infrastructure, but more importantly, it's thinking about where the industry is going. And from an investment standpoint, and from an investor's point of view, you asked before, where's the smart money going? It really is going where people are comfortable. So for me, I've always had the viewpoint of brands create and hold tremendous value. And so for what I'm looking to do moving forward is focusing on the brands and potentially the licensed operators as part of that infrastructure. And we see that in traditional CPG, brands hold the value, and we have this really interesting marketplace now where you have to be vertically integrated. Well, that's not how most industries operate, but there's value across the supply chain.
How no industries operate, right? I mean, I can't think of another one. Can you?
They don't, but certain companies do. At scale, you might have a wine producer like Gallo who builds their, creates their own glass bottles.
But they don't have their own liquor stores.
They don't, and they're also not allowed to. So there's differences there, and obviously that will play itself out. So from an investment standpoint, I do believe in looking at it, across the industry, looking at the landscape domestically and internationally, seeing where cannabis is, where the sort of influx of hemp-derived products are given the Farm Bill. And it's, opportunistic in a lot of ways, and it's still fundamental. Everything right now is still foundational. There is a lot to be done. So, as we launch our new vehicle, a big part of that firm is going to be focusing on being very diligent, institutionally focused, having the right governance and controls in place, and leveraging the infrastructure that we have. I mean, a big part of what MGO and ELLO does is provide platform for information and knowledge sharing and support for the industry, as well as for how we want to support the industry from a principled perspective.
As an East Coast guy, I've been watching jealously as the West Coast states have all the fun, one state at a time, legalizing recreational cannabis. And then Massachusetts came online. And now we're in the game. And New York and New Jersey are in this neck to neck race to see who can legalize first through a legislative process. I was wondering, who are you betting on? Who do you think is going to get there first, New York or New Jersey?
Yeah, it's always fun. I mean, being from New York, that New York, New Jersey rivalry is always present, and now we see it kind of rising up again. Obviously, both states, if you will, have made it clear that legalization is a priority. New York is still earlier in the legislative drafting phase. We've kind of seen the direction of where Cuomo wants to go, but Jersey's a little bit further. They have plans in place. They're waiting final votes. I was in New Jersey last week for an event, and it seemed like there was a very imminent process for legalization, within weeks. So New York has that momentum. It certainly has Governor Cuomo's, public view and push, and that's really powerful. But it does seem like
I want New Jersey.
Is ready.
I live in New Jersey.
I live in New York.
Seems like Jersey's ready.
Yeah,
to
well,
process
take a bet.
on first.
Yeah. Well, look, if New York goes legal, it doesn't matter because it'll be in Manhattan and it'll be fine for me.
Right.
Yeah, it's what are they going to stop me at New Jersey Transit?
Well, the PATH train in New Jersey Transit might have a different scent over the next couple of years. We'll see.
I have to tell you, over the last couple of years, you walk down the streets of New York, and literally over the last 2 years, the scent that wafts through the streets is so fundamentally more pleasant than it used to be.
Smells better than cigarettes.
Yes.
Better than cigarettes, too.
So, man, you got into this industry early, and everybody makes mistakes. And I really believe wholeheartedly that we only learn from our failures. We don't really learn from our successes. Is there a failure that you look back on and one you're like, I still don't understand how I got that one wrong? And what was the lesson you took from that?
That's a really on-the-spot question. Thank you.
Yeah. Hey,
yeah,
by the
you
way,
finally got
I'm
there.
also going to ask what size your shoes are, what size
Right.
your waist is,
Gosh, there are so many mistakes that I've made throughout my career, which is really, to your point, it's where I learn. It's where I step back and think through what have I done well, what do I need to improve upon, and really think about things, more holistically. And, for me in this industry, a lot of it has been not trusting my gut. And that's from early on. I mean, there are things that I had not done as I wanted to do back in 2015 and 2016 that still remain relevant today, and is still why I have, so much energy and passions that there's still so much more to do. But trusting my gut is probably the biggest weakness that I've had, is that I've not done so. And I have relied on some other people throughout the process that I should not have. I've trusted some certain, opportunities that I should not have. And, when the red flags are there, be mindful. They're there for a reason, and be very cognizant of them. And I think that's for everyone. The industry is plagued with dishonest, distrustful people as much as it has many people who are honest, caring, and giving. And so depending on your perspective and who you are, and who I am is someone who wants to add value and create community and positively impact all of the stakeholders, that's where I spend my time and energy, and I trust my gut in that more now. And it took me some time to get there, but that's something that I have learned over the past few years is important.
Would you say you're a better judge of character now than you were?
I would definitely say I'm a better judge of character. I will also say I am very trusting, and I'm very giving, and that's just my nature, which sometimes, causes great harm, but it's also who I am. So I am a little bit more cautious in entering into relationships, professional relationships, with people, but I am a better judge of character, and really trying to understand someone's intent. And if the intent is good, but they're just not getting there through actions, then that's someone I could probably work with. If their intent is bad, in addition to their actions, then that's someone that I tend to avoid.
That's good. Interesting. All right, let's get. We're at about the 45-minute mark. I want to ask one or two more questions about MGO, and then be respectful of your time. You guys, historically been LA based, but you're now opening up a New York office. You coming to take on Markham and some of those guys?
Yeah, this is not a sudden change for us. We've always been interested in obviously the New York market, the Northeast, and really just the Eastern Seaboard for a while. So it just made sense for us to have a presence there, and not just for the cannabis practice, for everything else that we do. We have a large entertainment, sports, and media practice, a large travel and gaming practice, and technology and healthcare. So, we're not a one-trick pony. New York makes sense for a lot of reasons. Obviously, the capital markets and financial capital of the world. And given that is a significant focus for us moving forward with our ELLO business and some of the other related transactions, we wanted to make sure that we had a presence there as well. So that's really the intent behind it. We're happy to take on anyone and everyone because we're really focused on what we're doing and how we're supporting the industry and our clients.
Is there a fundamental difference between the types of companies that you work with in New York than the ones that you work with on the West Coast?
It's an interesting question. Fundamentally, they are structured slightly differently because of where they are set up. They're limited markets with limited licenses. And so they have to think through compliance and their obligations a little bit differently. They're historically not as entrepreneurial, meaning that they can't take as many risks and do different things. But what they have done, very interestingly, is they've been more focused on expanding and creating this multi-state operator approach because they've had the knowledge and the resources of financial ingenuity and scaling very quickly from an infrastructure standpoint.
And they didn't have the California market to play with, right? I mean, it's the biggest market in the world.
They had to be very nimble and very intuitive into what markets made sense, given that they were limited license markets, and entering those markets more aggressively than what you see in California and Oregon and Colorado, Washington, et cetera, where you have a lot of companies and a lot of competition. And so they built themselves slightly differently. West Coast has been more brand and culture focused historically, obviously cultivation experience and manufacturing and having the more, robust ability to cultivate. Whereas New York, you haven't really had that, or the Northeast markets, you haven't had that. And it's been sort of a brand new industry. Just the mindset slightly different.
All right, so we are there. We are the last question, and then we will let you go. You have a pretty broad and expansive view of the industry. If you could tell the LA Times or the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal, what story are they missing? What is everybody not paying attention to that they should, right? Like, I love the statement that Wayne, I think it was Wayne Gretzky, said, like, he skates to where the puck is going to be, not where the puck is. Where should we all be looking? What's next?
Yeah, another great question. What's next?
I'm going to put you on the spot, but this is the last time, I promise.
No, and it's great. I mean, it makes me think, and I've viewed this industry maybe like some and unlike some others. I don't see the difference between the cannabis industry and what we've seen traditionally developed in other markets, whether it's traditional CPG, healthcare, technology, et cetera. The biggest trend where this is going, for me at least, is much more personalized and intuitive products that people can understand, or hopefully will be able to understand, through robust research and development of both health and wellness and pharmaceutical products that are much more aligned with our lifestyles. And whether that is active or, more in the arts or entertainment, or in having to focus in very specific, legal or medical fields, I think the personalization of these products will outpace what we've seen in any other industry. But we'll see the segmentation in very much the same way. We'll see the CPG model, the food and beverage, the cosmetics and health and wellness products and nutraceuticals, as much as we're going to see less toxic, much more beneficial pharmaceutical products for people who suffer from ailments that are not being addressed by pharmaceutical products or are being worsened by pharmaceutical products today. So The personalization to me is where this is going, and that creates opportunity for many brands and segments that are not currently addressed in the industry today.
That was awesome. Thank you so much, man.
Our thanks to Evan Eneman, CEO of the MGO-ELLO Alliance. You can follow Evan and MGO-ELLO by visiting elloinsights.com and mgocpa.com. As always, if you want to chat with us, you can find us on Instagram and Twitter with the handle @the_greenrush, or drop us an email at greenrush@kcsa.com. And don't forget to subscribe to The Green Rush on your favorite podcatcher. That's one take, Shay. One take.